Hello again, everyone. Please welcome director RaMell Ross back to the screen. Thank you so much for being here. It's such a brilliant film.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for being here.
So I'm going to start with a few questions, and then once the conversation's going, hand it over to you guys. So to start off with, I was wondering if you could just talk about the history of your relationship to the place and how the teaching led to filmmaking and what it was that you initially wanted to capture.
Yeah, so I moved there spontaneously, and then really was integrated in the community before I started, which was a kind of, not a blessing in disguise, but just like a strange blessing. I didn't intend to make a film. You know, I kind of moved to Alabama just to live an inexpensive life, like pay my bills, which were like mounting, because I was like buying all this photo equipment and stuff, and wasn't quite making money as a freelancer. And then, yeah, the process of being there, and I'm not sure if you all are familiar with the historic South, but Hale County is in the Black Belt of Alabama, which is part of the Black Belt of the U.S., which is this huge swath of land from like Texas to Florida that has really rich soil and where the majority of cotton plantations were, and so therefore there were the majority of plantations, and so when slavery ended, you know, all the social issues, it's like a hotbed still for social issues in the U.S. So yeah, being there, coming from the North, or just coming from anywhere in the U.S., it's like such a fascinating and unique place. And I couldn't recall any film explorations of the place at all that weren't, you know, kind of slave stories, I guess. So I kind of, you know, jumped in.
It feels like as you're filming it, you're discovering a new way of storytelling, like with questions like, how do we not frame someone? There's all these double meanings and layers of meaning, and I was wondering if that formed your approach and if that was your experience as you were making it.
Yeah, so it wasn't I guess it was my experience of making it. I think fundamentally the film is born out of a couple ideas that each one doesn't necessarily hold more value than the other, but one core idea of the film is, what is it like for a black African American to return to the historic South as the sort of cul-de-sac for the black experience, the black American experience, but also to, like, what is it like to deal with the stereotypes of self? What is it like to deal with the landscape and the myth and the tragedy and the hope? And so using the camera as a way to understand the way in which I see. So that's kind of the sort of baseline sort of, I guess, concept. I forgot your question. I'm sure it was good though.
It was about it feels like you're discovering like a new way of storytelling.
Yeah. So then so then in this process of looking and seeing and shooting from like this really, you know, specific perspective, you know, you start to, you know, for me, a photograph is only in dialogue with other photographs. You know, it's like not really in dialogue with the real world. It's to me, that'd be like a sculpture is in dialogue with the real world. It's something that's a reductive representation that has, you know, aesthetic values. And so you look at film and you look at sort of film history, and there's certain ways in which most cinema entertains folks. And, you know, most of it has to do with the narrative, which is using certain moments to represent a person or to represent a character or to represent a place. And given the relationship between black culture and consumerism, black culture and entertainment, and black culture sort of being something that has sort of a true foundation, but is typically reproduced and produced by white folks that aren't in the community. There's a strange misrepresentation that's fundamentally part of it. And so it was interesting to me to be there long enough to look at moments that wouldn't normally have narrative value or wouldn't normally have, it would take more time to get than someone is willing to spend because they're on a film budget or because they have, some sort of theme or motif to carry through in their project.
I think there are really interesting things in it about looking. Like, there's that moment with the young woman who looks like she's at a prom and how she gazes at the camera and then she goes back to her own thing. Or at the beginning, the guy in the car, or even sort of Kyrie's toddler eye view.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about these different forms of looking within the film.
Yeah, that's, I almost feel like there's, half of a book worth of just talking about the concept of gaze and the way in which, your gaze can change, or the way in which you're sort of confronted with another person's subjectivity or humanity or evilness through some sort of glimmer in their eyes. There's something interesting to me when you're watching something and you're a passive viewer, and then out of nowhere you seem to be confronted with the process of what you're doing by something that's happening on the screen or even the person on it. It's interesting to watch a film when you're like following someone and then they like stop and they like break that fourth wall and you're like, oh wait, that was a little strange. And so I wanted the film to be reflexive, and I didn't want one to take for granted that they're fundamentally a spectator, but I'm creating something to allow them to participate as much as possible in Daniel and Quincy's lives, but not take the act of looking for granted, because that's kind of where, that's the first act of meaning. And so, once it gets to your brain, it's already gone through the socialization process. So how do we account for that,
I think one of the things that I really love about it is the sensory logic that it unfolds with. And I think what you're saying there about looking is really interesting, or your preconceptions. It feels like there are moments which unfold which you're expecting, or as a viewer I was expecting something bad to happen because, say, I don't know, there's this moment with all these lights, like the car lights, the white light, the red trees and the blue, and you think, oh, like the police, like there's something bad happening. And that kind of aspect of the way you play with people's expectations is really interesting. Is that something that you had sort of built into, like, challenging like what you think is going to happen next in the narrative? Like,
yeah, it's something that I noticed from making photographs. You take a photo of some sort of environment, some sort of scene with someone doing something, and if you try to complete the narrative of that image, if it's like a narrative type of image, you're forced to contend with your imagination. And there's such a limited range of black representation relative to like white representation, that we tend to expect certain things. And there's all this science around it. There's like, they call like the Bayesian brain, in that the mind is a probability machine, in that we're standing on the corner and cars coming, and we're like unconsciously calculating the speed and the probability of these things happening. It's just the way in which we deal with time, the past and the future, and the way in which we are capable of living a life that's full and productive and have agency. But when you apply that to a person's potential, or you apply that to stereotypes of folks, you're trapped. You're forced to respond to the information that you've had about folks in the past. And so once again, the relationship between black folks and media is one that's really complicated and not so great. It's really easy, in fact, to provoke someone into thinking that something else is going to happen. It's also the nature of film. Like, that's how films play with emotion and play with the viewer experience. So yeah, I was super conscious of it. It's actually really fun too. And I think the most interesting thing was challenging myself and filming something and thinking something and then rethinking something and then trying to translate that for the audience.
And there was that bit that I felt like you have the past in dialogue with the present when you're driving up to the plantation and you're seeing that bit of archive footage of that man like peering through the bushes. I was wondering if you could talk about that, both that dialogue and also that film, because we were talking about it earlier before we came in.
Yeah. So the the archival clip is a clip from a film called Field Day, Lime Kiln Day. It's the same thing that happened before. It's a little confusing. Lime Kiln Day Field Day Club. There's not 2 days in a title. So you guys get the point. It's difficult to say for me. But it's this old film that was produced about the same time as Birth of a Nation, and was really fascinating because it portrayed like a sort of middle class black lifestyle. Burt Williams wasn't blackface. That's kind of how he was forced to perform. But strangely, it was kind of uplifting and relatively normal. And so this film didn't come out. And then, Birth of a Nation comes out. We know what that did. So it's really interesting to think of what happened if this one did, or what if both came out and there was this counter narrative to all of these awful stereotypes. But this clip, I felt had a really interesting. It's the only continuity cut in the entire film. It has this even just a formal relationship between what's happening there. So there's sort of meaning at that point. But what's most interesting to me is like forcing the audience to acknowledge that there's a spectrum of black representation. That there's a visual story of blackness, and it starts with cinema and with blackface, and then you're forced to contend with the way in which you watch the rest of the film, realizing the way in which that history is, just slightly under the skin of the film and slightly under the skin of black folks in general. There's history is sort of just absorbed into the present, and constantly it's like culture is kind of like a perpetually crashing wave, and history is just that force that keeps it crashing. And to be aware of that is helpful, to not underestimate the relativeness or the arbitrariness of time and change, and the past's relationship to the present.
I love the way that you explore time in the film. It's something that I don't think I've seen in any other non-fiction films. It's just the way you show these in-between moments and the passing of time, and those sorts of moments that don't usually get counted as like the event, but in fact those are the sorts of things that form memory. And I was wondering if you talk about like your structural choices, your like choices of making the narrative that kind of experiential, sensory.
Yeah, I think that's also a really big one, because it's like how do you like literally give someone an experience? So not have someone watch something, which is also an experience. It's like, how do you give someone the capacity to make meaning with their own language from something that is seemingly not overly propagandistic, Like, how do you open up? How do you like put someone in the woods and allow nature to give them an experience, and they walk out and they have to like form their own language around it? So the idea is like to do that inside the context of Hale County, and from my point of view. And I found quite early on that when I'm filming, and the longer you film, the more interesting, or the more random things can happen. You're just capture like the most beautiful things, like stuff that you wouldn't even think to script, because it's not something the imagination produces. Like at the end when Quincy's showing me himself rapping on his phone, and it's like he's like kind of showing off, and then what his Boosie calls him, and wifey comes up, and he's like, ugh, and he like brings it up to his ear, and you can like see the kids. Like, that's such a beautiful, normal thing that doesn't have narrative utility normally, but that's kind of what our lives are composed of, which is these pretty mundane and banal and relatively boring things. And so, yeah, to give that to someone is to give someone access to a life and a perspective and a community and a world that is at one time universal, but fundamentally absent from one's daily life. Because you can't unless you're spending time with Quincy or with Daniel, you're not going to get that. So it almost gives you the same type of moments that you would spend with your best friend in some sense, and is a really strong connective tissue, I think.
Thank you.
And there's more to be said about that, because I think the interstitial is like the most interesting thing in the world. You know, like in between the mountains, like mountains are great, you know, but, you know, deserts are cool too.
Like there's some really, one of my favorite, well, probably quite a few people love this too, that shot of the tree with the smoke.
Oh yeah.
Like that's just stunning. Like that.
It's so strange too. Right? Yeah, I'm like standing, like looking up in it. It's weird because so as a photographer, there's, you know, I'm like over conscious of what is like a trite image, or what is like a visual platitude, or what is an image that you would see on like a big image sharing platform, and like everyone's like, oh cool dude, wonderful flower, you know, and they're like, oh man, those waves are ill. You know, like, I love the way you captured the light trickling off of that drop of water on the sidewalk. And you're like, it's a fucking drop of water on a sidewalk. And granted, I think that's cool in cinema sometimes. But for photography, when you first start off, like, the act of capturing something with beautiful light, with nice form, seems to just be something that's, like, revelatory. So a lot of times when I'm shooting, like, the basketball hoop, when I'm looking up, like, I'm doing that time lapse, and I'm like, I don't know. You know, like, it's a hoop pointing up, and like everyone sees the hoop. It's like it's like so many things are overwrought, you know, so many symbols have been, you know, bashed into, you know, annoyingness or something. So I was worried about the smoke.
But you've got that conversation in the background though that makes it like, adds a banality to it, like what are you doing kind of thing. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
So
the guy's like, I don't know what the hell you doing. I was like, me either. Really. I think later I'll understand it, but right now it just looks cool, my friend. You know?
Do we have questions? Yes. We'll go to you first, and then there's one down here.
Hi there. Thanks. Love the film. There's some
man.
really beautiful moments in there. Did you find it a challenge to like maintain a sense of the magic in the footage and a lot of the shots that you have whilst you were piecing the film together and trying to, you know, find your story? Because you know, like you spend so much time looking over your footage and trying to build it, and you become so familiar with it that you kind of lose maybe a sense of that original spark, right? I mean, I don't know if you found that, and if so, kind of how you dealt with that.
Yeah, you know, I understand what you're saying. That just did not apply to this one. I said funnily and respectfully, only because like the film is like looking for a specific type of jubilance, you know, or a specific type of elevation that you literally I wait 3 or 4 days to find. And when that happens, I know it's there, you know. You know when that moment with the phone, like in the film, you know when you walk outside of the trailer and they're playing video games after many hours, and there's a storm just appears, and Terrence puts his arms out. It's, you know, a beautiful moment, and then it goes away in the film, you know. And so every time that would happen, I would just put that on the timeline, because I had 1,300 hours of footage. There is no going back to the footage, you know. It would take like a year. I mean, that's, you know, it's a really long time to watch and to analyze. And so every single shot that is in the film was on the timeline once the hardcore editing process started happening, but I was already editing the entire time. And then the challenge is to make the story, or to make the logic that can allow someone to make it through the film without falling out, or teaching someone how to watch the film and read the film. That part's challenging, but in terms of scanning the footage and sort of losing the spark, the entire film is about sparks, you know? And so you can't lose that. You got no film.
And we've got a question just down here.
Thanks. Really good film. Thank you very much.
Hey, you guys don't have to say that. When you...
No, I'd like to, because
okay.
I really enjoyed it. It was really experiential and kind of, you know, I really enjoyed it. I want to talk about the sound and the music and how you approach that, because most of it seemed like it was just the sound raw, but then some bits were very accentuated, and then the music was quite varied. And I was wondering how you kind of approach that and how you work with a composer. I think I saw Alex Summers there or something. So I was wondering, can you talk about that?
You know Alex's work?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, Alex is great. Alex and Scott Ilario, they have this band Parachutes that did really well, and then they stopped making that type of music. But so one core idea for the film was to sort of skirt narrative and skirt whatever 3-act structure in whatever superficial sense, because I think it's interesting to share that, you know, early on in the filming process, I realized that documentary films and films in general, but documentary specifically, they put an enormous amount of pressure on the person who's in it. Also, the pressure that they put on and the type of footage that people get fundamentally offers the person in the film up for judgment on a platter for the audience, which kind of undermines the idea of connecting with them, because if we're bringing our judgment to every single thing they do, then when good or bad things happen, we're kind of like, well, I wouldn't have done that, or, you know. And so, you know, we thought that if we could get away from the capacity, the explicit space of judgment that happens between what's happening on screen and with the audience, then it allows the person to just be in touch with the person, but it also puts the burden on the system that the person's in. Like, you actually look at the environment. And so the way in which we tried to skirt that was to look to music as a structure for the film. So the film's made up of like 5 visual movements that have 5 songs that are attached to those. And then, you know, a big influence on the film is Godfrey Reggio's Quincy trilogy. And one thing he talks about is taking the, you know, what would normally be background music and bringing the background to the foreground and making them inextricable. So all of those segments are kind of supposed to be, you know, doing that. In terms of like sound design and the soundscape, it's a really big question, and it's hard to talk about in any sort of short way, aside from, you know, we used Lucretia Martel's La Ciénaga as the sort of reference point, because I remember watching that film, and I would think about, you know, what I saw, and I watched it again, and I remembered things that didn't happen, but it was because the audio is so great. Like, you know, it's recalling images of stuff that's not there. There's conversations happening off screen, and there's this weird way of it extending the frame sonically, and so that was a marker. And then also sort of playing with, you know, sort of contrast of, you know, with what would be considered, you know, art or whatever for documentary film and for like Black folks in this space. Like a lot of play. Once we had those sort of core values in place, then it's like up and down, you know.
Do we have other questions? Yes, we've got one there in the middle.
Hi there, thanks for your time. I just wanted to ask you how you sort of began, because did you sort of begin with the idea of shooting a film, or did you begin with the involvement, or did you begin with both at the same time, or how did it sort of happen?
What do you mean with involvement?
Well, because you got to know those people, presumably who were maybe your students or some people you knew or whatever they were, and then you sort of slowly they sort of emerged during the film in some way. And I was wondering how that was for you in terms of sort of thinking about it from the beginning and then what it became, sort of how that sort of emerged out of what you were doing.
Yeah.
in terms of filming, because the filming style of nothing really changes, does it? You know, it's very consistent actually from the beginning. So I was worried because you took a long time to make it, right?
Yeah.
So
well, it depends on what you think a long time is.
Yeah, no, it's a very short time.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
just depends how you see it.
Yeah.
But and the other thing I wanted to ask you was, I've spent lots of time in Alabama, in that part of Alabama recently, and it's such a powerful ambience, and yet in your film it's sort of very peripheral actually in one respect, through the roads or through the burning or through the cotton fields or through the buildings or through but it's really at the edge of your film, and you've sort of kept it there. And I was wondering how you'd thought about that in terms of the characters and where you were and who you were within it, and how it sort of emerged in that respect. Sorry, that's 2 questions.
No, I mean, they're kind of the same, but kind of not. Yeah, I love your first observation. So one of the challenges with the film is, you know, just kind of based on some of the ideas, just like interstitial moments, but still character driven, but no story and no narrative, like musical, like all of these different things. It's not, there wasn't quite a model for how to do that. And so the challenge became, how do we, and it arguably happens and arguably doesn't happen, but how do you teach the viewer how to watch the film? Because if you don't, regardless of whether or not you say the film is poetic and lyrical and all of these different things, you're watching it expecting a certain type of engagement, and that one takes you out of it, and then you just don't like it because you're not able to just sort of sit back. And so the 10 minutes of the film became the most important, and so, you know, that part is kind of like hyper contrived, not that the entire thing isn't, in order to, like, you know, give you Daniel and Quincy in a way in which they like emerge from a community of images that are associatively edited, and there's no and they kind of organically sink back in, and then they kind of emerge back up, and that was the strategy that we found. But, you know, when I first started making the film, 2012, I shot for 5 months, and I made an edit just to like make an edit. And I'd never made a film before, so, you know, it was really traditional. There was like a voiceover, and Daniel's like playing basketball in a gym, and Quincy's like in his living room or doing all, you know, like rapping or something. And I couldn't imagine someone watching this film and really learning anything about the place or the people or what it was like to actually be there. And sort of out of that, the frustration of that edit, I like went back to the footage 5 months in, and found all the moments that I thought were like really beautiful and really kind of unique and had some sort of symbolic or metaphoric value, kind of intuitively tied those together on a timeline. And then that was the first iteration of this. And I was like, oh, what if I could make an entire film this way? It would be really interesting. And I was like, okay, that's what I'll do. But I thought that it would take 10 years because based on the amount of images I had and how long I shot, I calculated it would take 10 years. So I was like, all right, that's cool. But what happened was, now that I knew that I wanted to make a film of these specific moments, and I wasn't sort of shooting with the normal scene or the normal whatever, then the process just sped up because I know what I'm looking for. And so I would go in, you know, to Daniel's basketball game, and I would put, you know, the camera. I've only did this once, but instead of like shooting the basketball game, I put it on Daniel's back, and I'm like, okay, I can see the rim there, and I can see a little bit of the court, and I like focus in at f4 or whatever on his shoulders. I just leave it there for like 4 hours, for like the entire game, for like 3 hours, and then something happens in that frame because that's the frame that I thought was beautiful, and then that's the moment that I have. So that was kind of the process once I've realized the way in which I wanted the film to look, that I could just sit on things that I thought was beautiful. And in terms of Alabama and the periphery, I was really insisted on just not making a film that typically depicted the place, and so I just avoided everything that was overtly, you know, like Alabama, or because there's like a lot of poor things, a lot of like abandoned properties. There's a lot of, you know, clear markers of the rural South, and not that I don't, you know, bring those into the film, but the process was just having because when you go to that place, those things are so beautiful. You concentrate on them because you're outside. We're an outsider, and the place precedes us. And then for me, it was about not focusing on that and just looking as you would if you lived, which I did.
Do you have another question? I have a question. I really like the intertitles. I really like how they're playful, but also they encourage imaginative participation from the viewer. And I was wondering what your ideas were behind those.
Yeah, it came really late in the editing process because, I had an edit team that I talked with, Jocelyn Barnes, Maya Krinsky, and RaMell Ross, in order to, just make the most out of the process in the film. And we realized that the film, because it was all visual and then it was like hyper visual, you're looking at an image and you see it, and then the next one comes up, but you're still thinking about the last one. So then you miss this one, and then like that process of trying to catch up or following up, you just the cumulative process of the film is kind of lost. And so we needed breaks somehow. And those breaks were, kind of referencing, once we put Burt Williams in there, we're like thinking silent film, and silent films have intertitles. And so I do a lot of writing anyway, and so we now we're tasked to write specifically for ideas in the film, or perhaps give someone a better entry into the imagery. And, I fundamentally think that, society sort of conforms people away from poetry, which is the most natural way, I think, to be in the world and to see the world and to express the world. And so, and fundamentally in poetry, I think is philosophy, because it's more evocative and tactile than, industrial and rigid and directive, not necessarily, but sometimes. So we decided to just use that language as a way to create space for guidance.
Do we have one more question? Because I think that's all we've got time for. There are no takers? Okay, yes.
Yes.
Just wondered, how did a featured poem come to be on the project?
Yeah, I was, I was like, put up my phone, I texted him. I was like, yo, dude, what's up? He's like, man, I haven't heard from you since yesterday. And I was like, yeah, man, it's been a long time. It's a really bad joke. I'm sorry, everyone. How did he get involved? So Jocelyn Barnes worked on Cemetery of Splendor and Uncle Boon Me. If anyone doesn't know who a Pichapong Weerasethakul is, I'm not saying his name right, but it's close. He's this literally a visionary filmmaker that just has a language of cinema that is unknown and only known to him, but yet wildly generative and quite beautiful. But so she thought that he'd be interested in the project, just as someone who loves cinema. And when we sent him a really, really early cut, he was like, oh, I really love this work. And she was like, gotcha. You want to consult? And he was like, yeah, whatever. Yeah, because he doesn't do that type of thing. He kind of does his own thing. And so the process was just, we'd have an edit, we'd send it to him, and he would write some notes and send it back, and did that a couple times over the sort of tail end of the editing process. Yeah, quite fortunate, because he's a really insightful dude.
Well, that's all we've got time for, but we will be showing this film every day for the next week, so please tell everyone to come and watch it. And thank you very much, RaMell Ross, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Bertha. Thank you, Sophie.